Okay. Welcome, brother.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure, and a gift to me, Juan Carlos. Juan Carlos Arean, I just want to give you a little bit of your bio, is the program director at Children and Youth Programs at Futures Without Violence. Juan Carlos' areas of expertise include engaging men to end violence, working with DV offenders, the intersection of fatherhood and domestic violence, cultural approaches to end violence, facilitation, and curriculum writing. Juan, over the years, we've had many conversations on how do we engage in ending violence in our communities, in our families, in our societies. And one of the things we've talked about is that over time, based on our experiences, we develop these masks that we wear, which is a term that you have taught about. Other people call it a cover story, these ways of being that don't really fully represent who we are. It's how we've learned how to engage in the world. And many times they're detrimental to us and they're detrimental to those we love.
Yes.
And so around this context of, as we go through this pivotal moment in our world with all the chaos around us, what can each of us do to make this a better world from your perspective in ways big and small to bring nonviolence, to bring love into these spaces?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a beautiful and deep question, James. So thank you. As always, I enjoy your level of depth and when talking about these issues. You know, for me, the most important thing is that we need to be working in ourselves, right? I mean, we see right now a lot of race and activism, which is excellent. Young people, I'm in New York City, so literally every day marches go by, you know, near my apartment here, some of which I have joined. And it's very hopeful. A lot of young people of white and Latino and Black together saying enough is enough. And that's so important, so momentous in some ways. And at the same time, I think we all need to be looking inside and asking, what part are we playing in this? You know, not only pointing the finger about, yeah, it's the police, is the system, is the courts, is the politicians. But at the same time, we have to point the finger to ourselves too. Whatever identity you have, right? We as men, for instance, as you mentioned, most of my work is, does that mean from my own life? In which ways have I learned to be, as our friend Steve would say, cruel with others and reproduce that in my life? You know, in which ways I separate myself from others and feel like, well, they are the bad ones and I'm the good one. I think that will never take us anywhere. And I understand the passion of young people, and I think I love it. I think it's essential. And yet that separation for me is a pitfall. It's a trap. I think the way that we will move this forward is to really understand that we, in fact, are all one. And I don't mean this in a superficial way, and like, oh, let's all get along and bypass all the pain that needs to be looked at this moment. But it's more about realizing that we all are capable of cruelty, of abuse, of discrimination or discriminating upon others. And and as we work on the outside, we also work on the inside. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So this, how do we get individuals to come to that level of awareness, or what kind of work are you talking about that brings us into our inner awareness?
Yeah. So that's a huge question, again, because there's so many points of entry and such complexity anyway, right? So you and I have worked with groups of men and have tried to, I'm sure both of us, find different points of entry. How do we help someone and help ourselves with that process of change? And maybe the answer isn't how do we help ourselves, and how does that reverberate in others. For me, a lot of my work in the last 4 years has been around the issue of apologizing and apology, and especially apology in the context of ceremony. Based on an experience that I had down in Mexico, where I'm originally from, and where I ended up synchronistically, really without planning it, in a ceremonial, in a ceremony, apologizing for the atrocities that my people, the Spanish, did upon the Mexica, or better known as Aztecs, but they like to be called Mexica people down there. And I ended up doing a direct apology to a Mexica elder that was very moving, certainly for me, certainly for him, certainly for the other people that witnessed it. And for me, that personal work, and really the work that led me to that, right? It just didn't happen automatically, but has been cultivating my own spiritual practice, getting exposed to different ways to looking at myself, to asking for help from the divine realm, right? So that eventually took me to this place in which I had one of those moments looking at this man's eyes after the apology, in which I felt total union with him. And that's something that has stayed with me. It wasn't only something that came and went, something that I don't think will ever leave me. And even though it was a very individual and personal experience, I've been talking about it, showing photographs to people, leading circles in which I invite people to find in their hearts what they need to apologize about. And I've seen that it has created a very deep level of healing in some people. It's not for everyone, right? There's many different paths to get to the top, but this is one that has been very powerful and heart-opening for me. And really it has changed some of the ways that I see the world. When the murder of George Floyd, or the lynching of George Floyd, happened, it just touched me. I know it touched many, many people and in different ways, but for me it was so personal, and I was so broken that during one of my meditations, actually, what came to me was my brother was killed, and I was in such pain about it. Interestingly enough, in that same meditation, I also got the message, my brother killed my brother. So I don't only saw George Floyd as my brother, but I saw the cop as my brother too. And then the last part of that was said, I killed my brother. So I have a role in all of this. So for me, it's been a very deep, personal, and in some way, I don't know how to label it, but a mystical journey, a journey that goes beyond what I can just see and perceive in this plane. If that, I know that makes sense to you.
Yeah. You know, I've known you for a while, Juan. I'm allowed to call you Juan because we're brothers.
Yes.
But I've known you for a long time, Juan Carlos, and you're a beautiful human being. But I
Thank you.
do address that you have a practice, right? You
Mm-hmm.
every morning, and you do one of the things you shared with me is the Ho'oponopono, the forgiveness,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I'm addressing that because we're really good at talking about strategies, right? And coming
Mm-hmm.
up with curriculums, but we're not really good at the practice because it doesn't
Mm.
overnight, right? This is a way of
Right.
being that you're talking about. This isn't just
Yeah.
an experience in a meditation and coming to a sense of clarity. This is how you treat everyone, right?
Mm.
That Ubuntu. I know from seeing you and how you live, that's a real core of who you are. Ubuntu,
Mm.
I am because you are, right?
Yeah.
I am satiated if you are fed, right? I am hungry,
Yeah.
hungry. And so when you talk about these young people, most of our movements have come out of rage, right? Where
Yeah.
people have said enough, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it can't sustain itself there. And
Right.
and the ability to see that cop as a brother, you know.
Mm.
So can you talk a little bit more about that piece of it? Because I think if we can get people to understand that, um,
Mm.
and through the work that you experience with Steve, is that unless we're with each other in our pain, unless we're with each other in our suffering, we're not going to that place that actually leads to transformation.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting because I think as we do our work, maybe a first step is developing empathy for those who are um, overtly suffering and those who are overtly oppressed, right? And that's work. It's work to get there, and not everybody is there. But that's in some way easier than what I see. Another step, which is exactly what you were saying, is how do we connect with those who we see as oppressors, as monsters, as the enemy, right? And for me, that's the deep work. So I've told you this before, but as part of this practice of Ho'oponopono, which is a practice of apology, every morning for the last 4 years, I have apologized to the president of the U.S. Okay, and this is not an easy thing to do, but the context is that if there's anything I've ever did to create the environment in which this happened, in which this person who I think is in a lot of pain, although he probably doesn't identify that way and is inflicting an enormous amount of pain too. But any part that I have played, and this is just what I believe in this life or any lifetime, I want to apologize. I want to take responsibility for that part. There's something very powerful about taking responsibility about something that seemingly is not your fault, right? So when I apologize to an indigenous Mexican for what happened 500 years ago, I know many people would say, why would you do that? It wasn't your fault. You weren't involved, right? But one of the most powerful things was like, no, I'm taking full responsibility for this, and that was so healing for me, because when you take responsibility for something is when you can start changing things. We know this at the different level with men who use violence, right? As long as they are denying, justifying, minimizing, right? They will not change. They have to own what they did, and that doesn't mean that we make them feel little or ashamed of. It's simply, it's part of the healing process. Is saying, this is what I did. Hopefully in a place of guilt and not shame, right? Like feeling bad about what they did and not who they are, although it's sometimes hard to keep that balance. But if they move from there, then that's the only way to heal, right? And to make that change. So I believe at a higher level, white people in this country, white people in Mexico, which is my group, right? Or men, or able-bodied people, or straight people, you name it, right? We need to take full responsibility for what our group has done, not to shame us, not to paralyze us, but to be able to change, to say, okay, this is what we've done. Now, what are we going to do about that, right? And listen, of course, to the people that we have hurt. So for me, it's part of the healing process to put yourself in that place.
Juan, you were in New York during 9/11. Is that?
I actually was here before 9/11, and then I've been after 9/11. I wasn't here when that happened, no.
But you experienced what people went through in terms of specific, and then how we created again another monster, right? The terrorist that exists out there. Just again, is that innate to us? Is that, I mean, that's been through the ages, right? It just, these moments getting passed down. I guess you and I have had so many conversations about how frustrating it is for us when we try to identify that there is a complexity to us, but then when you put us in a box, it's so much easier, right? Once you label the monster, the abuser, the terrorist, the policeman, you know? Yeah, so back to, and I just want you to finish with a discernment on this. You're making us each responsible, right, for ourselves first. And in that process of awareness and consciousness, there is what Steve talks about within us, the possibility of connecting with that golden shadow, right, with in each of us. Can you talk a little bit about that piece from a spiritual perspective? How do we get to that light? And then also, we get to a place where we balance, where the joy and the sorrow are one, right?
Yeah. Yes.
That non-dualistic place where suffering and the dance of joy are the same thing in a sense, or one without the other.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, there's no shortcut to this. I think from my perspective and from my experience, this is the hard work of every day, waking up in the morning, and whatever your faith tradition, whatever you practice, whatever you have adopted, having that discipline to meditate, to pray, to give thanks, to walk, whatever it is. But I think the consistency is what gets us to the place where we want to be. You were a theater person, I know, and I was a professional musician. So we have that in common too. And, you know, I never expected that I would pick up a guitar and start playing complex stuff without spending hours and hours and hours playing scales and doing things that seem trivial and unimportant. It's the same thing, right? Like, or with a sport or with anything else. You want to build that muscle, you know, and you cannot say, I did it and just let it go, right? It's like, I've gone to the gym for a year. Okay, I'm set for the rest of my life. No, 2 weeks later, you lost everything that you worked for that year. And it's interesting because I've been listening to the teachings of a woman who is a Mohawk elder, and just this morning she was talking about that during this time of the pandemic and of uprising and of such blatant racism and violence in our faces, it's even more important to do that practice. That's what will keep us going in the long term, because this, as you know, is a marathon. This is not a sprint. We need to sustain ourselves in the long term. So for me, I don't see any other way than whatever you practice it is. And as I said, there's many ways to get there. Hopefully it's a practice that cultivates love, that opens your heart, that connects you with whatever you believe, whatever you want to call it, that divine energy, or that beyond our reality. Because, you were saying before, this separation is that innate, and again, that probably is one of those things that you can debate forever. But, you hear people saying, well, that's human nature, right? Like to separate yourself, to see an enemy, and many other things. People might say violence is human nature. And one of the things that I like to, at some point I came back, well, that might or might not be true, but what I aspire is something beyond human nature. I aspire to divine nature. And I do know that is not divine nature, that separation, that fear, that lack of love, that's not divine nature. So whatever practice we have, as long as it moves us closer to that divine nature that we all have and we all are capable of having, I think that's the work, right? And this is, as you know, it's nothing new. Every great spiritual teacher and political teachers, MLK Jr., just, going back to his wisdom, right? Love thy enemy. Just sitting down and reflecting deeply in what love thy enemy means, which of course was Jesus saying that, right? What does that mean in this context? And that doesn't mean justifying bad things that people do, right? Justifying the fact that I felt that cop was my brother is not about like justifying what he did at all, or any police brutality. And that's where people get tripped a little bit, right? How can you love someone and at the same time say what you're doing is not okay? And for me, actually, that's at the heart of it. Because if you come with someone with hatred and you say that's not okay, they're less likely to hear you than if you come with love and you say that's not okay, right? And I will not let you do that because I love you, right? And again, it's not, we go back to people like MLK or Jesus or Gandhi or the Buddha or whoever else. It's not about this kind of like fairy love. It's about this deep love, which I love. One thing that MLK wrote is with sense of humor. Is like he said something like, I'm paraphrasing here. I'm thankful that God asked us to love our enemies, but not to like them. Because I really don't like these people, but I love them. So I think that with some humor encapsulates what we are talking about. I don't like that cop, but my job is to love him until he changes.
Thank you, brother.
My pleasure. Always wonderful to talk to you.